Hello again and welcome back to Church History. We're studying the Reformation now, having left the Middle Ages a couple of weeks ago. Now I wonder if you've been thinking something. This is something that struck me when I was first studying this topic. You remember what we said about Martin Luther? There he is, he's striding across. This is all in my imagination actually, but he did come up to Wittenberg Cathedral. He had a hammer and a nail and his 95 Theses, if you want to know what they were, look at the previous video. And he nails these 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. And I said that was the first step of the Reformation. That was when the Reformation began. Now you might be thinking to yourself, as I did, why would a monk or a lecturer, or he was both, why would that start a reformation? Just banging a document to a church door. Well, the thing was about that document, we're going to say perhaps more about this next week. The thing about this document is that it was, if you like, a spark that lit a fire that was there ready, the stuff to burn was there ready, just waiting for the spark. God had prepared the way, God had prepared circumstances. As you remember what we said last week about some of this preparation, we said that Luther wasn't the first person to stand up and criticise the church and the papacy for what it believed. Remember I said there were four groups who were famous for opposing the papacy and the Catholic Church, and we said the first one was political thinkers like Marsilius of Padua. We said the second one was there were university lecturers like John Wycliffe. There were priests such as Jan Hus in Bohemia, and there were breakaway churches such as the Waldensians, and so there was a background of discontent, particularly from about 1200s onward, regarding the church. And as we said last week, as interesting and as powerful as these protests were in their own way, they failed to make a lasting impact. But it wasn't as if the Lord finished there. The Lord was still preparing the way, and what he had done, he was steadily undermining the structure and authority of the Catholic Church in other ways, and to use an illustration, imagine the Catholic Church as a great big cathedral. Now imagine that the Lord is burrowing away underneath. He has his engineers there trying to weaken the foundations. Or imagine, use another example, all this fire, tinder, all this dried wood or dry grass being gathered together underneath the church, and it's just waiting for the right spark. Well, by the time Luther turned up in 1517, it was ready to burn. The church was ready to fall. Certainly in the north of Europe. So what was it what ways was the Lord undermining the foundations? Well, there are four that I want to mention before we talk any more about the Reformation itself. And the first one was this. The church was beginning to have an undeniable reputation for corruption, and that really weakened their reputation in the eyes of people in Europe. And the corruption came in two ways. The first area of corruption was really sexual immorality. You may know that the Catholic Church today has got a bit of a reputation with paedophile scandals and that kind of thing for sexual immorality. Well, this isn't anything new. This was rife in the Middle Ages. For instance, when Luther visited Rome, I think it was at about 1510, he was a German, he'd never been to Rome before, he was sent on a special message to go to deliver to the papacy. from his monastery. And when he went down there, he was absolutely shocked at how godless and immoral Rome was. And he said that there were, well, I think people were fairly aware that popes had children. You know, they're not even supposed to be married, but they obviously had children out of wedlock. But they had lovers, they had concubines. The priests and cardinals were famous for having their own brothels in Rome. There were scandals about the behaviour of monks and nuns, living too close together, the pressure obviously being too much. And in one monastery in, I think it was in France, after the Reformation, they drained a large pond at the monastery and found lots of dead bodies, dead children's bodies. Obviously there'd been sexual immorality, nuns had got pregnant and they'd thrown the babies into the to hide them into the pond. This kind of thing was beginning to become so widespread that you weren't frightened of the church anymore. You weren't intimidated by the church because it didn't have a moral backbone to intimidate you with. So there was sexual immorality. There was also institutional corruption. Top positions in the church were given to the highest bidders. Now, why would anybody want to have a top position in the church? Well, the thing was that the Roman Catholic Church, it controlled an enormous amount of land. The Roman Catholic Church controlled a third of the land of Europe back in the day when there weren't any factories. This is all before the Industrial Revolution. So you made your money from growing crops from agriculture. And there was land attached to bishoprics, there was land attached to monasteries, there was land attached to particularly the higher offices of the church. And if you had this land, you had an income coming in, and sometimes it was a massive income coming in, and there were massive estates where people paid into the church. And if you could get that one of these top jobs, you would be made for life, and you could probably work out getting your son or your daughter or some other relative in the position after you've left it. And so the people at the top of the organisation weren't spiritual people. They weren't moral people. These were big businessmen who dressed up in Catholic robes, and people saw this. There were taxes that you had to pay besides the rents that came from the land. You had to pay a tax if you were ordinary member of a local congregation. If your child was born, you had to pay a tax. If you got married, you had to pay a tax, you had to pay a fee. If you died, you had to pay money to the church. There were tithes that you had to pay for the church. It was just a big business enterprise, and it was morally corrupt, and it was institutionally and financially corrupt. So number one, corruption. The second engineer burrowing under the foundation of the church was nationalism. Now in Europe, the barbarian tribes like the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns and the Franks, over periods of hundreds of years, they'd actually turned into kingdoms, and the kings wanted to control as much of the land as possible, because land was money. And as I said before, if you've got an outside organisation that is taking a third of your income every year and taking it off to a foreign country, well, that could be pretty annoying, unless this other organisation, the church, was helping you in other areas, other important areas. And so all this money was being paid from kings to the Roman Catholic Church, and it was very expensive. But then you found that, say, the King of England was having a dispute with the King of France. or the King of France was having a dispute with the rulers of Italy, and you went to the Pope to get a decision, because these are all supposed to be Christian princes, all listening to the papacy, and you went to the Pope to get a decision. And how would you feel if you're paying all this money and the Pope comes down on the side of your opponent rather than you? You ought to be really miffed, wouldn't you? Now, you know how the Reformation started in England. There was the King of England, Henry VIII, and he wanted the Pope to grant him a divorce from his wife Catherine so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And he sent Cardinal, he sent his Cardinal over there to petition, and the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted. And so that initiated the breakaway. So as these nations grew, unless the Roman Catholic Church was prepared to hand over a bigger share of their cut to the kings, then the ties of loyalty between kings and the papacy would weaken, and that was certainly something that was happening in the 1500s. The third tunnel digging under the foundations was, let's call it, papal infighting. Now, what does that mean? Well, the Pope's prestige rested on his claim to be God's only spokesperson on earth. He was supposed to be, as it were, Jesus in the flesh, almost. Jesus' representative on earth. Another God on earth is the way he was described. And he wasn't empowered to the church just to rule over the church. He was supposed to be ruling over kings and emperors and everybody else, because he carried Jesus' expressed authority. But in the year 1417, there were actually 3 popes at the same time. Now try and get your mind around that. And you say, well, how can there be 3 popes? How did this come about? Well, the French were involved in disputes with the Italians over land and various issues, and in the 1300s, 1200s and 1300s, and they just could not get the Pope to rule against the Italians, who they had an argument with. Why is that? Well, where does the Pope live? In Italy, in Rome. So the French were saying this is heavily biased. So do you know what the French did? In 1307, they went and kidnapped the Pope, and they brought him to live, and his entire court, in Avignon in France. It's quite clear, isn't it? You come and you live here, and if you don't do what we tell you, well, we haven't got to come to Italy to sort you out. You're living on our doorstep. And this lasted from 1307 to 1377, and it was 70 years. It was called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. That's how 70 years was how long the people of Israel were in Babylon, if you remember the time of Daniel. Well, by 1378, the Italians decided that enough was enough, and so they decided that they were going to elect their own pope. So from 1378 to 1417, you could take your pick. You could either go for the French Pope or you could go for the Italian Pope. And so these 2 popes were working with various kings to see if they can get kings on their side. Now, during this same period, was something happening between England and France called the 100 Years' War, which you may have heard of. It was argument over whether the English, who were basically a French aristocracy, the English were ruled over by French aristocracy, whether they owned these great tracts of land in France, or whether the French aristocracy owned it. And they were fighting and arguing. And when the English approached this French Pope, guess which way the French Pope voted? He would vote with the French. So the English monarchy decided that they would recognise the Italian Pope because he agreed with them. And you can imagine people looking at this and thinking to themselves, well, where's the authority? this is ridiculous. This isn't spiritual. This isn't even logical. And so, because of mounting pressure, there was a big church council in 1417, and the council decided to sack both popes, excommunicated both popes, and appointed their own new one. So you had two deposed popes and a pope appointed by the council, all claiming to be pope at the same time, and that really did reduce their credibility in the eyes of a watching world. The fourth thing that really undermined the papacy as well, and this was more of an intellectual level, a scholarly level, was the Renaissance. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Renaissance. Perhaps if you go down to the National Gallery in London, and you'll see some of these absolutely gorgeous paintings that were painted between roughly 1250, 1300 up till the 1500s, of stories of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, and stories from Greek and Roman history. And if you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, you see the sculptures that were produced there by people like Michelangelo, and paintings by Leonardo da Vinci. Remember the painting of the Sistine Chapel in Rome by Michelangelo? Well, this came about because there was a great interest, a revival, that's what Renaissance means, a revival interest in Greek and Roman culture. Now, where did this interest in Greek and Roman culture come from? Well, for that, we have, I think, largely to thank Islam. Now, you remember we were talking about the Crusades, we were talking about Islamic expansion, they were moving through what we today know as Turkey, but was back in the Middle Ages known as the Greek Byzantine Empire, the Christian Byzantine Empire. Well, as the Islamic armies moved in, they would tend to burn libraries. They would tend to burn anything that would appear to criticise the Quran. And so lots of monks, when they knew that it seemed to be a fairly inevitable process that the Byzantine Empire was going to fall to Islam, a lot of these monks began to take all their most precious documents, that's the writings of Greek historians and Roman historians, and a certain amount of sculptures, and take these things, particularly stuff that's written in Greek, because you remember in Europe the language was Latin, and they took them under their arms, and they took them to the great universities of Europe, and people said, "Oh, this is very interesting. Oh, Greek. Nobody studied Greek for ages. And let's have a look at the art and architecture. Oh, this is very interesting. Let's study Roman and Greek culture more closely." Now, there are a number of other interesting things that were written in Greek. For instance, the writings of the early church fathers for the first 5 centuries of church history. Many of those documents are written in Greek, and when these Greek documents came to the universities and people were learning how to read Greek, they were looking and seeing that what the early church believed about the church and what the church in the Middle Ages believed about the church were almost two completely different things. You read the writings of the church fathers. There's no pope that they mention. Particularly before about 300. They speak about Jesus, and Jesus lived a very simple life. He wasn't carried around like the Pope in a great big sedan chair. Jesus wasn't dressed in robes and gold and jewels, encrusted clothing. He and the apostles lived humble lives. If you walk past Jesus in the street, if you walk past the Apostle Paul in the street, you wouldn't have known him from anybody else. He wouldn't have stood out by clothing or grandeur. And when you read the writings of the church fathers about salvation, they weren't directing people to the church, which was basically the preaching of the Middle Ages. You want to be saved, then you become a loyal member of the church. You You do what the church tells you to do. You confess your sins to the priest. The rise of the early church fathers, they directed you to Jesus. Go to Jesus for your salvation. Now, this really stirred up people at universities, and people were saying, what happened? This isn't Christianity that we've got today. This isn't the Christianity as it originally was. And they began to ask big questions. Now, there is another very important document that's written in Greek. Can you think what that might be? Yes, the New Testament. That's written in Greek. And all these Greek manuscripts, hundreds and hundreds of them, were being brought to the West to be examined in the universities. And there were scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was a very famous priest and scholar. And what he did, and he published this in 1516, the year before Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Erasmus gathers all these documents together, and he starts to work out what is an accurate Greek manuscript that you could base a translation on. And he came and lectured at Cambridge University for a while. And there was somebody else who was also studied at Cambridge University. He studied at Oxford as well, but who was particularly influenced by Erasmus and his love of the Greek New Testament and a desire to have it translated properly into everybody's ordinary language. Well, it was a gentleman known as William Tyndale. And William Tyndale was the gentleman who gave us basically our authorised version of the Bible. And no matter which version you use today, they're all essentially based on the William Tyndale's work. And so people were beginning to read the Bible in the original language and seeing that there were huge contradictions between what the early church believed, what the Bible taught, and what the church actually believed and taught. So there you've got these engineers burrowing under the foundations, working the foundations. Or here you have Renaissance or Nationalism piling up this wood ready for someone to light a spark. And Luther comes along in 1517, and people in Germany are angry about all the money that is being taken from Germany and sent down to Italy. They are concerned about papal corruption. There's a rise in nationalism. Luther himself and most of the other great leaders of the Reformation, they were all themselves Renaissance scholars, people who were interested in these innovations. And Luther is beginning to see through the veneer of Catholicism. And when he comes and nails his 95 Theses to the church door to Wittenberg Cathedral, what he was doing, he was announcing that he wanted to debate these things in the university. Now, he wrote them in Latin. He didn't write it so ordinary people could read and be stirred up about it. He wanted to keep this at an academic level. He wanted people to say, look, come on, let's have a think about what Christianity has become. Let's compare Christianity to the Bible and let's reform the church. That's what Luther wants to do. Well, somebody, after Luther had nailed these 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, very craftily took them down. They didn't have photocopy machines in those days, but they copied them, and they used something else, a fifth thing that really undermined the Roman Catholic Church. You know what that was? It was something that had been invented just before the Reformation, perhaps 60 or 70 years before. The printing press. Before the printing press, you had to write everything out by hand. A printing press, you could just crank out the 95 Theses in thousands of copies in a matter of days. You could take the Greek New Testament, and you could, instead of having it taking years being written out by hand like the monks and scholars did, you could be cranking out Gospels in days and getting them all together and putting them in one big book. and somebody's copied the 95 Theses, got them on the printing press, thousands of copies, and within weeks Luther's 95 Theses were all over Germany. And within a few months they were all over Europe, in universities, in places where skepticism about the power and authority of the Roman Catholic Church was under threat already. And so what is Luther doing? He's going tsh, and he lights the bonfire. But God had prepared the tinder already. Now, next time we're going to start talking about the great characters of the Reformation. People like Luther, people like Ulrich Zwingli, people like John Calvin, and then in the weeks to come we're going to look at the Reformation, particularly the Reformation in England. So if you're interested in Henry VIII, his 6 wives, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, martyrs being burned at the stake by a woman, queen known as Bloody Mary. If you're interested in Puritanism, if you're interested in fact in the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell, you will see that all this comes out of the Reformation. So look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you. Bye.